Okay, so now that we have our animations all set up, we're gonna go back to Bolt. So, um, no, actually, what I want to do, let's just name this thing Door Trigger. Oops, I got a typo. And let's child it to the portcullis door main parent object, and then select that object and go back to your state graph down here, and we're back in Bolt world. And so what I'm going to do is, I guess, double click on the closed state here, and this is where we can kind of define what happens when we are in this state. So all we need to do when we are in the closed state is check this. Oh no, make sure is open is false. So make sure this box is unchecked. All right, so the way we do that is basically on interstate, I think makes sense. So I'm going to click and drag that out, and when I release, it's going to be like, okay, what unit do you want to connect to this on interstate? So I know it's inside of Animator, and it's called setBool. That's the thing that, that's the C# code in the Unity API that we need to call to control that animation parameter. So I'm just going to search for setBool and see if what comes up. And there it is, animator.setBool. There's a couple choices. We're going to use the one that uses the name comma value method signature here. And so now we have this node where we can set the bool of an animation parameter. And so we need to tell it like what the animator is. And so by default, it's gonna use the self here, which means it's essentially like calling get component animator. So it'll look for an animator that's on the same game object, and that's what self means. And so in this case, that'll work because this animator component, which is what owns the animation parameter that we're looking for, is actually on the same game object as our state machine component, which is Bolt. So this self works. So once we get to this node, when we enter the closed state and we go to the setBool node, we need to control an animation parameter called isOpen. And this is like a point of failure here. If you don't name it identically case sensitive to how you named it here, it will not work. So make sure you carefully match this name of the parameter to whatever you're typing in the name field here in this setBool animator setBool unit. And next is value, and you can see it's a checkbox just like we have here. And so we want it to be false when the door is closed. Remember, we're in the closed state right now in our flow graph, so we're inside of the closed state. When the door is closed, we want this bool for isOpen to be false. And we don't really need update, which would work just like update in your regular C# script where whatever's hooked up to this will get called every frame. We don't really need to do anything every frame. And we also don't really need to do anything when we exit the state, but it's cool to know that you could. And if you remember your state pattern stuff here, the author has it set up where you have like an on exit, an on state enter. Yeah. So we get that built in with Bolt here also. But we're only using on state enter in this case, so let's just delete that. So now all our closed state is when we enter the state, we set that animation parameter to false. Now I'm going to click here where it says portcullis door. You can see right now we're inside of closed. If I click here, we'll go back to the top level of our state machine, and we need to set up the open state. So same thing, we don't need exit, we don't need update, But when we enter this state, I'm just going to drag this out and release and search for set bool again and use name value. And self works in this case because, again, the state machine component is on the same game object as the animator component that owns this animation parameter that we care about. The name of it is open, and you have to carefully spell that out to match your animation parameter, and the value this time is going to be true. And so this is essentially going to create a setup so that when we're in the closed state of bolt here, that checkbox will be open, and when we're in the open state, it will get checked. So we're controlling that checkbox through bolt. The last step we have to take care of is when do we transition from closed to open. So let's double click on this transition and decide when it's going to trigger. So I think what we can do here is just kind of click and drag out, kind of like the opposite of what we did before. And I want to transition when the player enters into this checkbox. So actually, I'm just going to hit escape. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to hit add unit because I guess I'm not quite ready to hook straight into this yet. So the first thing I need to find is on trigger enter, which we're in a 3D game, so you don't want to pick 2D. So I just have this on trigger enter, but it's not directly hooked up to that. And that's because we need to make sure it's the player that enters that trigger before we transition to the next state. If it was just like an enemy or a box or something like that fell into this, we wouldn't want the door to open. Maybe an enemy you would. It kind of depends. But in our case, we only want to open the door if the player is the thing that walks into this. So rather than directly connecting from here to here like I was about to, I'm going to create an intermediary thing that is going to be compare tag. And again, these are just all functions that are in the Unity API, right? If you were to go in here and search game object compare tag, you will see this is just a method you could call in your C# script, which is why I like to use the programmer naming convention when we installed Bolt, just because if you're at all used to the Unity API, it'll be a little easier for you, and it'll also help you learn the API better. All right. So I somehow got really crazy scrolled here while I was doing that. We were looking for compare bool, or compare tag rather, and compare tag is going to allow us to check if the thing that enters the trigger has a particular tag. Now, I actually don't think we ever applied a tag. Oh, look, it does. So double check that your player actually has the player tag. I don't remember putting that on there, but I guess we did, so that's good. Make sure that you have the player tag on your player. And here is where we're going to define what tag we're looking for. This is another easy point of failure because it's relying on me typing this in exactly like that's typed in right here. So be careful. But now if the thing that enters the trigger is something that has the player tag, this green one will go. And if it's not, this purple one will go. So we don't really care if it's not the player, it'll just go into nothing world. We don't want to do anything. But if it is the player, we want to transition, which if you click back to this master state machine level, we're transitioning from closed to open if the player enters the trigger. Now there's one more issue here before this is going to work. Remember with the animator set bool unit we were using, we were able to use the self option here because the animator was on the same game object as the state machine. But in this case, if we click on our portcullis door, which is the thing that has the state machine on it, this does not have the trigger component. So on trigger enter here can't use the self option. So we have to plug something in so it understands where that trigger that we're caring about lives. And so that's something we need to use a variable in Bolt for. So what I'm going to do is go to the window menu and choose variables. And hopefully it works without me restarting Unity this time. It did. That's cool. So I'm going to dock this one. It's related to Bolt. So I'm going to stick it in the same panel where my graph inspector is so that all my Bolt stuff is kind of in one spot. And then I'm going to make a new object variable. So you can see there's different types of variables with Bolt. And in our case, we want to make an object variable because this is a variable that's going to be shared across the current game object. And so it would work if we did scene, and you see these are variables that are shared across the current scene. But eventually we're going to make this thing a prefab, and that way we can have multiple doors. And if all of the doors shared the same variable in the scene, they would all be controlled by the same trigger. And we don't want it to work that way. We want them each to use their own trigger. So we need to make sure this variable is handled on a per object basis. So we're going to make a new variable here. And so I'm going to hit the plus button. Oh, we have to enter a name. Let's call it door trigger. And for type, we need to choose game object. And so the value is going to be this trigger right here. So what I can do is click this checkbox, make sure we're on scene, and I'm going to find that door trigger. There it is. I think probably I could have dragged it in like this too. So that might be an easier way to understand the connection. So now that I have this variable created that represents this object, I can click on this little handle and drag it in, and I can connect it. So this door trigger object, which represents that, is the thing that is going to be used to determine what trigger event we're caring about. So on trigger enter relates to this object. So this is the thing with the trigger component that is going to be used in this on trigger enter event. And then when the player, based on the player tag, enters the trigger, we will transition states. All right, cool. So that works well. Let's test it. I guess I shouldn't say it works well. Let's find out. I'm going to click here so you can kind of see when the player enters here, we should see it move from closed to open. So let's see what happens. All right, so I'm going to walk forward here and I'm going to enter the trigger. And I don't know if you saw it, but the animation worked. And also you should have maybe noticed this little circle kind of flows from closed to open to kind of help us understand it within the context of Bolt. So that's working. Now we just need to set up when the door is going to close. So let's double click on this transition from open to closed here. And you can tell which way the transition is going by looking at the little arrow, which is kind of confusing. I realize there's two arrows here, right? One of them is in the transition, but one of them is part of the transition. This is the arrow that we care about. And once we add some logic here, you'll see this other transition icon is going to change. So anyway, I think as a game designer, it makes sense that when the player walks into the trigger, it opens, and then I'll go through the door, and when I walk out of the trigger, the door can close again. So that means we're looking for on trigger exit. So let's search for that. And there it is. And again, this trigger is not on the same object that our state machine is on. So we need to use this variable, but we already made the variable in this macro. So we don't need to make it again. We can just drag it and we will plug it in right there. And next we want to check and make sure it's actually the player exiting the trigger. So we'll use compare bool, compare tag, and check whether it is the player, because that's what corresponds with the tag that's on our player game object here. And again, the purple one is for if it's not if this would return false, you would do the purple one. If it returns true, we do the green one. And so if it's the player that leaves the trigger, we will trigger our transition. And in this case, it was the transition from open to close. And you can see that little icon did change. So if I run the game now, I think it's going to just be done. Let's test it out. So I noticed some people made comments about how this is inverted by default. Maybe we'll have to talk about how to fix that. But sure enough, it appears that our door is working. Yeah, that's cool. All right. So there is our first taste of using Bolt as a state machine. And again, if you look carefully down here and you're not in Maximize on Play and you can see the state graph while you play, you'll notice that little ball traveling to help you understand the flow of the states. So it's pretty nifty. All right, cool. Well, I think that completes this little sub-series. So let's make one last commit. I will save everything. And we can kind of summarize what we did here. We used, defined Bolt state transitions for our door. And I'll commit this and push it. And I'll see you all next time.